Hello, 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 and welcome to Alexasrewm, where we are not lawyers, we are not medical professionals, we are not law enforcement, we are just people. People who have opinions about all things going on in the true crime community, including what the heck is going on with the Ashley Benefield case. Ashley Benefield is the former Florida ballerina who's been charged with second-degree murder for fatally shooting her late husband, Douglas Benefield, in an act of what she claims is self defense. This case has been deeply, deeply fascinating and also moving at a lightning speed. So, we're going to do our best to catch up over the next couple of hours, getting through the rest of the state's case because in Alexa's room time, we're still on day three. In real time, we're at closing arguments. So, without further ado, let's dive into Dr. Russell Vega. He's the medical examiner, so he's going to talk about the autopsy that he conducted on Douglas Benefield. So this is going to be really interesting testimony because is it going to line up with essentially what the state had led with in opening statements, where the bullet holes where the bullets entered and exited Douglas Benefield's body, and where exactly the firearm, or could we potentially guesstimate where the firearm was even shot from as well too. That's going to be a big key part in this case, and you'll see next they're going to call their firearm expert as well too. The state is before they rest, and I think in terms you usually save the medical examiner for last anyway. So without further ado, let's dive in.
In order for me while we do that. During your autopsy, did you determine the height and weight of Mr. Benefield?
I determined the height and the body length, as that's what we measure with the body reclined on the table. I think it's a very close approximation to height. It might not be exactly the same.
Yes, sir. And what was Mr. Benefield's weight at the time of his homicide?
It was 169 pounds.
And the length?
The body length was measured to be 69 inches, or 5 foot 9 inches.
Thank you for converting it for me. And during your external exam,
because again too, the state wants us to believe that, which is really interesting when they start their rebuttal case, or start their rebuttal, is really homing in the fact on Douglas Benefield's size. So trying to make him I think they said he was 90 pounds. I thought he was 170
The
pounds.
height and the body length, is that's what we measure with the body reclined on the table. I think it's a very close approximation to height. It might not be exactly the same. The length is that.
Determine the height and weight of Mr. Benefield.
I determined the height and the body length, is that's what we measure with the body reclined on the table. I think it's a very close approximation to height. It might not be exactly the same.
Yes, sir. And what was Mr. Benefield's weight at the time of his homicide?
It was 169 pounds.
Oh, 169 pounds. Sorry, I misheard that. So they want us to the jury to really understand that, oh, he's a small guy. He's slender. He's smaller than most men. So how could he possibly have been intimidating to Ashley? And I just feel like that is just such a gross mischaracterization of what DV can look like for so many different survivors, because it isn't one size fits all, and somebody can be equally as intimidating. Somebody who's a body lifter, they could be the biggest teddy bear in the world and the least intimidating person. So I feel like this is just kind of playing off of gross stereotypes, and to say that, well, he was only 169 pounds or around there, around 160, 170 pounds. He couldn't possibly be intimidating to intimidating figure, or let alone even put hands on Ashley. Meanwhile, it's like you look at Ashley and what is she, like 105 pounds? Like, even if she's tall, she still weighs like half of what he weighs. And that it's just so grossly incomparable to, like, just, it's such a weak argument in my opinion. But again, some jurors might look at this and be like, wow, like, he was a small guy. And we saw pictures of him, and I think the defense did a really good job of this when they were characterizing what Douglas Benefield looked like. He was in shape. And beyond just in shape, he wasn't just a slim, slender guy. He was muscular. Most of probably his weight came from muscle mass. He's also a trained fighter who would talk about his love for fighting. So I don't think I mean, I get why the state is going in that direction, but I think overall it's probably one of their weaker arguments. And I kind of feel like, and I've said this, I think I said this on Twitter a couple of times too. I wish this wasn't the state's case. I wish they wouldn't have, I wish they would have just acknowledged Doug is who he is. This is the man he was, and he's not a perfect victim. But in that moment, was he did he feel intimidating to Ashley? Was she in fear of her life in that moment? I think if they were a little bit more sympathetic to Ashley and her testimony, which we're gonna get to in our next video, and they just completely redirected the angle of this case, instead of just trying to completely gaslight us into thinking that he wasn't this violent person. He didn't have these violent tendencies, because he did, and he admitted it. There are text messages proving from him acknowledging that he did these things. So I feel like by trying to make him seem like he's not this big, scary, intimidating figure, it's just a gross mischaracterization, because it doesn't matter how big or small you are. I mean, how many male survivors are there out there who are afraid to come forward, because it goes back to that age-old stereotype of, well, you're the man, and no, you're bigger than the woman, and women can't be ABUSERs. They can't be. They can't be intimidating. They can't be violent towards their partners. So I feel like it's kind of contradicting itself in a lot of ways. And I wanted to stop and pause on that, because again, this is a theme that continues to come up, and it comes up back in their rebuttal, because that's all they can go, well, he was small. He couldn't have possibly been intimidating. It's so ridiculous to me.
And the length.
The body length was measured to be 69 inches, or 5 foot 9 inches.
Thank you for converting it for me. And during your external exam, as we discussed, those injuries are documented in these photos as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to now show you. Sorry, Judge, just bear with me.
Okay, so they're gonna get,
Am I taking a look at those photos? And
I think these are the autopsy photos, which we don't obviously get to see.
telling me if you recognize them.
Yes, I do recognize them.
And what are they?
These are photos taken at the time of the autopsy of Mr. Benefield back in September 2020.
And did they fairly and accurately depict some of the injuries and some evidence that was as they were in September of 2020?
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. This time I'd ask to enter states 86 through 97.
No objection. Received.
Thank you. And generally, when you examine Mr. Benefield's body, I'm going to display them out here in just a moment.
Okay.
Did you find injuries on the outside of his body?
I did, yes.
And where were they? And we'll talk about them in detail, but generally, where were they?
There was an injury to the right side of his chest. There was an injury to his right shoulder, and there was an injury to his right leg.
Okay, so right leg, right shoulder, and I think he said left side of the chest.
I did, yes.
And where were they? And we'll talk about them in detail, but generally, where were they?
There was an injury to the right side of his chest. There was an injury to his
right side of his
right
chest.
shoulder, and there was an injury to his right leg.
All on the right side. All on the right side. Okay.
And
Keep
did
that
he
in
have
mind.
any injuries to his face or head?
No. Well, he did have to his head. Yes, I'm sorry, not his face.
And what type of injury was that?
The injury to his head was what we would typically call in medical terminology, we call an abraded contusion. That's a swollen and scraped bruise. And it was on the very back of his scalp at what we call the occipital protuberance, or the lump at the very back of the head.
And what would that type of injury be consistent with?
Typically, it's from falling backward and striking the head.
And when you were
Falling backwards, right? Which is interesting because depending on the angle or how close in range Ashley was to Doug. Because remember, I don't know if this is actually, I might be kind of fast forwarding in my brain or not. There's just so much testimony to keep track of. But I don't know if it was a crime scene tech or somebody else, and it could even come out in this testimony of the essentially the swollen contusion in the back of Doug's head. If that could have been caused by a actually, I think I'm skipping ahead too much. But if this could have been caused when the not the crime scene techs, when the EMTs arrived on scene and were pulling him out, and they testified that they dragged him out of that room. Now that we understand how small that room actually is, it might make sense that there wouldn't have been a stretcher. They probably weren't able to get a stretcher in there. So again, a little bit foreshadowing in the future, not to spoil, but that is something that I believe was testified at some point, if not in this testimony, in a later testimony. We get to see actually how small the room is. And essentially, what is testified to is no, that is not possible. For him to sustain those injuries, to get like smack the back of his head on the back of the door, to get that level of swelling.
were looking at his external injuries, did you have some opinion as to what had caused them, specifically the chest and the leg?
Yes,
And what did you feel that they were?
they were gunshot wounds.
And did you then conduct an internal exam?
Yes,
And did that internal exam confirm what you felt about that they were gunshot wounds?
yes.
And I'm going to display behind you states 86. Oh, okay. And I believe this is generally what we call an identification photo. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is that Mr. Benefield as he was in September of 2020?
Yes,
Thank you. And then let's first talk about the injuries you said he suffered to the chest. You said that was a gunshot wound.
yes.
And how many defects in his body were associated with the chest wound?
There was one defect, and that was on the upper right side of the chest.
And is that what we see here in states 87?
It is, although we're also seeing the injury to his right arm area as well. Actually, that's the one that has the marker on it. And the chest injury is just above and to the right of that, at least according to the viewpoint of the viewer of this photo.
And for orientation,
To above and the right of that. But what did the state say about where those GUN shot wounds, where did they say those were? This is really important to show. So again, we're going to jump back to opening statements and what the state, I almost said the Commonwealth, the state had been saying, because as we know from the Karen Reed case, some things that are mentioned, which is essentially the case that you're trying to prove, that's why you have opening statements, so you can kind of set the stage for, hey, these are the claims I'm making, and I have the receipts to back it up. And when those things don't match up, that's kind of problematic for your case. Now, obviously, opening statements aren't considered as evidence, but it sets the narrative, it sets the stage for what the jury is expecting to receive in terms of evidence to make sure that it's in line with the case that you're trying to prove. So I want to go back and I want to play what the prosecutor had said during opening statements about where Douglas Benefield was shot.
She had cats in the house, but who knows? But this is the only injury to her. And the third thing is the trajectory of the fatal bullet. Now, he was shot multiple times, but one of the bullets was fatal. The trajectory of that bullet was side to side. It was not straight on. Doug Benefield was not facing her, coming at her at the time that the fatal shot was fired.
So she's pointing to her sides, but that's not at all what the medical examiner just said. He said that the wounds were the upper right shoulder, his right leg, and the right side of his chest. All on this side. Not side to side. Now, I know she's talking about trajectory, but she's not talking about where the bullet actually entered and exited. So I want to go back to the medical examiner's testimony. and see what he has to say. And we're going to take it back a little bit.
There was one defect, and that was on the upper right side of the chest.
And is that what we see here in states 87?
It is, although we're also seeing the injury to his right arm area as well. Actually, that's the one that has the marker on it. The chest injury is just above and to the right of that, at least according to the viewpoint of the viewer of this photo.
And for orientation purposes, this is his right side of his body?
It is, and I'll use the laser pointer to indicate this is the arm injury, and that's the chest injury, just to the right side of his right nipple.
And was there, you said there was only one injury. Does that mean this is an entrance wound?
That's correct.
Was there any, and there was
So by the right nip.
no corresponding exit?
That is also correct.
And did you locate a projectile that was associated with this chest wound?
I did.
And where was it?
It was lodged in the tissues of the left side of the back.
I'm going to show you states 88. I believe that's a close-up of the injury we saw on his chest.
It is.
And then can you kind of orient the jury as to what we're looking at in states 89?
Yes, this is the back of Mr. Benefield's body. He has been rolled up onto his left side. So what we're seeing here is his back, the head here. So this is the left shoulder. The right shoulder would be up here. This is the left side of his back. And it's this purple area right here that represents where the projectile was lodged under the skin and the tissue.
And did you remove it?
I did.
I'm going to show you states 90. Is that the removal process for the projectile from Mr. Benefield's body?
It is. In order to visualize it and then remove it, I made an incision in the skin, which you see here. And then just for documentation purposes, I reflected the
So
skin.
just go back.
This is the back of Mr. Benefield's body. He has been rolled up onto his left side. So what we're seeing here is his back, the head here. So this is the left shoulder. The right shoulder would be up here. This is the left side of his back. And it's this purple area right here that represents where the projectile was lodged under the skin and the tissue.
So obviously we can't see it, but if you can just picture it in your brain, they're saying they rolled him on his left side so that they're only looking at the right side of his back. He's not laying flat on his belly.
And did you remove it?
I did.
I'm going to show you states 90. Is that the removal process for the projectile from Mr. Benefield's body?
It is. In order to visualize it and then remove it, I made an incision in the skin, which you see here. And then just for documentation purposes, I reflected the skin with the tip of the scissors so that we could photograph the projectile in place in the tissue prior to its removal.
And Dr. Vega, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to states 89. Where you described his body, but there's some skin discoloration. Can you explain to the jury why his skin looks red or darker?
Certainly. That is what we call lividity. Lividity is the settling of blood in the tissues that occurs after death when the heart's no longer pumping, and the major force acting on it is gravity. When somebody's lying on their back after death, which is typically what we see, we are of the usual process of putting somebody on their back in a dignified position after death. And so the blood typically does settle into the back, and we see this purplish coloration here, which is a result of that. There's some here as well. This area here where there isn't any discoloration, except where the bullet is because this is where the table was pressing up against the skin, and that pressure kept the blood from settling in those areas. So most of this purple discoloration is lividity, with the exception of this area right here, which is due to a little bit of bruising associated with the placement of the bullet there.
And Dr. Vega, I'm going to show you what's in pre-marked as states 14. Would you take a look at that item and tell me if you recognize it?
Lividity was a big part of the
Yes, I do.
Adnan Syed case.
This is the projectile
Wow.
that I recovered from the back that you can see in the photograph you had up previously.
And other than having been repackaged for trial purposes, does it appear to be in the same or substantially the same condition as when you removed it from Mr. Benefield's back?
It does, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would ask to enter states 14.
Objection received.
And Doctor, I'm going to show you states 95. Is this the same projectile that you have there in states 14?
Yes, it is.
And what, if you know, is that red part that's next to the projectile?
This is a small rubber plug that is occasionally found in certain hollow point type projectiles. Not all hollow point projectiles have these rubber plugs, but it's part of the process of creating this hollow point that allows the projectile to expand and deform, as we see in this case here.
Thank you. And so going back to the location of the projectile, based on where the entrance wound was and the where you found the projectile, did you determine a path of travel that projectile took through Mr. Benefield's body?
I did.
And what was the path of travel?
So the path of travel was one of entering the right side of the chest, striking the 5th rib on the right side, the right lung, the 10th vertebral body on the in the middle of the spine, then the left lung, the 10th rib, and then the soft tissues of the back until it stopped where it is. And that path then, if one were standing upright and straight, would be from the right side toward the left, from the front towards the back, and essentially horizontal. In other words, without angling upward or downward. And again, that's relative to a standing upright position.
Yes, sir. And would you be so kind as to stand up and kind of point on your, and where would the exit would be?
Well, no exit. But
Oh, sorry, the projectile.
projectile,
Yes, sir.
my abilities are limited, but essentially would be in the back over here, where the tip of my thumb is.
Thank you. And would you just turn back so we can see the entrance again?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
So not side to side. So not even remotely close to side. And they just said projectiles. So going back,
And where would the exit would be?
Well, no exit, but
I'm sorry, the projectile.
a projectile,
Yes, sir.
my abilities are limited, but essentially would be in the back over here, where the tip of my thumb is.
Thank you. And would you just turn back so we can see the entrance again?
Yeah.
not side to side. This is definitely gonna be part of the thumbnail. Because that's insane. That's a flat out lie from the state. It's a flat out lie. That's why it's so important that we go back and forth. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't know because it's the state of Florida. So I don't know if they get readbacks in Florida. I hope they do. They can look back on this testimony. I don't know if they get to revisit opening statements unless they took notes during that time. But just going back to opening statements and what the prosecutor was saying about the projectiles, does this match up with what the ME just testified to?
They came from, she had cats in the house, who knows? But this is the only injury to her. And the third thing is the trajectory of the fatal bullet. Now, he was shot multiple times, but one of the bullets was fatal. The trajectory of that bullet was side to side, not straight on. Doug Benefield was not facing her, coming at her at the time that the fatal shot was fired.
And what did the ME just say? Let's rewind and play that back again because this gets me so angry. It's misinformation. And the jury doesn't get a rewind button, but we do, and we're going to call it out.
From the front towards the back, and essentially horizontal. In other words, without angling upward or downward. And again, that's relative to a standing upright position.
Yes, sir. And would you mind, would you be so kind as to stand up and kind of point on your body to where the entrance would be?
I don't know
Certainly.
why they would have him do this if it doesn't match up with what they said.
And where would the exit would be?
Well, no exit, but
I'm sorry, the projectile.
a projectile,
Yes, sir.
my abilities are limited, but essentially would be in the back over here, where the tip of my thumb is.
Thank you. And would you just turn back so we can see the entrance?
And they just glaze over it. Like the jury's stupid. Like they're not paying attention. So really interesting. But I mean, this is completely opposite. And I'm so curious to see what they end up saying in closing because, opening was over a week ago or just about a week ago, actually, from today of what we're posting. But I mean, I encourage you to go back because that is nothing like, because they want to prove that Douglas Benefield wasn't facing her. Because if he was facing her, their case goes to crap. Their case is a pile of poop. And they just glaze over it. Like we're dumb. Like the jury's dumb. And maybe if the jury's not taking notes or paying attention, they're only paying attention to what's being testified to now. But that's not what they were claiming in opening statements. It's not even remotely close. And I don't know how they just glaze over it. Like it's not a big deal.
Again.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
It's huge. He had to have been facing
And you said that the wound was front to back. Was it, and from how you showed, you said it was essentially horizontal.
Yes,
It wasn't front to back like it went straight through. Can you describe it?
certainly. I mean, it went through an angled path through the body, and that angle took it from the front toward the back, but at a greater angle from right to left.
Thank you. And you said that it struck his ribs and his lungs and his vertebral.
His vertebral body.
Thank you.
The
So
spine.
his spine.
Yes.
And would that injury have been immediately fatal?
Probably not.
And would it have incapacitated, if you can say, incapacitated Mr. Benefield quickly?
I think it would have incapacitated him quickly. Whether or not it was immediate, I don't think one can predict.
Thank you, sir. I'm now going to take you to the arm wound. Was this wound different from the wound we saw in Mr. Benefield's chest?
Yes.
And how so? And this, for the record, states 91.
Yes. What one can maybe not clearly appreciate just from viewing the photo, but was clearly evident at the time of the examination is that this is only a surface wound. So what you see as the mark on the skin
She's
here
not even
is the
looking
full
at
extent
it,
of this
you can
injury.
tell.
So it's an abrasion or a scrape on the skin, but outside of the effect on the
I don't
skin,
know, and like I see all this coverage from like gross Julie Grant, who is like the biggest like example of what mean girl energy is, and I'm just she is so frustratingly disgusting. I cannot watch any of her coverage. It angers the crap out of me. But like them saying, "Oh, she's faking it." Like, look at her. She's not even looking at the freaking photos. It's like she's damned if she does, damned if she doesn't. Because if the state did prove, yeah, and his back was turned, and acknowledge that, yeah, even if Douglas Benefield isn't the perfect victim, and he might have been a piece of human waste, and he might have done all these terrible things to Ashley, doesn't mean in that particular moment that her life was threatened. If that was the case they were trying to prove, would have been a bigger hill to climb, but it would have been more honest, and it would have been backed up with the evidence that you present and that you entered into this trial. This is insane to me. This is gaslighting 101. This is absolutely insane to me.
nothing deeper was involved with this injury.
Thank you, sir. And then you said he was also shot in the leg. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I'm going to show you states 92. Can you orient the jury as to what we're looking at on Mr. Benefield's body?
Yes, and this is a little bit of a tough one orientation-wise, but the injury is to the back of his leg. So what we're seeing here is the back of the leg, and it's excuse me, the calf area here. This is a perforation of that calf. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it, the calf area.
And the chest wound we saw entered and did not exit. Was this wound the same or was it different?
It was different
And how so?
because this injury did indeed have an exit.
And where did you locate the exit?
The exit was on the right side of the knee.
And Dr. Vega, how can you, and I have a picture of that, but before we move.
Maybe she shot him in the calf. I mean, I'd be so curious which injury seemed to have been the first, because I think that would also be hugely telling.
How can you tell the difference
Is
between
it a
entrance and
warning
exit?
shot?
It's not always
Wait
possible,
for him to
but
just
typically
stop.
entrance wounds have more of a well-defined defect in the skin. Frequently, that defect in the skin is paralleled by defect in the tissues that one can appreciate underneath. Many times, the edge of the skin perforation or the edge of the skin defect will have a ring or at least an arc of abrasion or scraping as the bullet passes through. Exit wounds tend to not have those features. One way that I like to think about this is it's like a very fast-moving awl or punch, in that it goes in and it almost drills a hole into the skin. But when it exits, what it does is it tenses up the skin until the skin tears. That's how a bullet exits. So typically, the tear doesn't have the same well-defined drilled appearance that the entrance wound rather does. And in this case, that's exactly what we see.
And I'll show you 93 correct me if I'm wrong, but that is the exit wound associated with the entrance we just saw.
That's correct.
And I have a close-up. This is states 94. And so can you kind of show the jury how you knew this was an exit wound?
Yes. So this injury does not appear to be a round or drilled type of defect, but rather a tear in the skin that occurred when the skin was stretched until its breaking point by the bullet trying to exit.
And were you able to determine the wound path for this injury?
Yes.
And what was it?
So the wound path started at the back of the leg and went through the musculature of the calf. And then I couldn't tell for certain if the path actually went through the bones or if it passed right next to the bones, but because of blast effect injured them, causing fracture. The amount of tissue damage can make that part difficult to separate out. And that was the case here. After doing that and fracturing the very top part of the leg bones, the tibia and the fibula, it then exited through this exit defect on the lower right side of the knee.
And I hate to ask you, but would you mind stepping down and showing us on your leg where this entered and where it exited?
Certainly.
Thank you. If you're more comfortable, you can. It's easier. Yes, sir.
I hate asking you this, even though you just asked him before to point to his nip. Like, okay. Kind of
Mr. Taylor, if you need to
cool
reposition so you can see, please feel free to do so.
like 1.5 speed, and
So
like him
on me,
sitting around.
The entrance was down here
If it helps, I can put my finger there.
and the exit here.
So here to here.
Yes.
And so that's, you said slightly up or up.
It's upward from the right toward the left and then from back to front. Yes, largely all three of those components.
This is just awkward.
Well, Dr. Ray, while you're down here, just for clarification, would you show me again the chest wound? Just because I think you're easier to see now that maybe you're on the stand.
Entrance. Logical.
Would you just spin one time? Just turn so they can see. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vega. I appreciate that.
Mr.
How does
Taylor,
that help
will be able to see both
you?
of those demonstrations? Yes, Dr. White, thank you.
How does that help you? That's not what you
Dr.
said.
Vega,
No,
is there any physical evidence associated with this injury that was recovered from Mr. Benefield's body?
From the leg injury?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there was.
And I'm going to show you states 15. You'll take a look at that and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, I do.
And how you recognize it.
This is the lead fragment which was recovered from Mr. Benefield's leg, just deep to the exit defect.
And how does this differ from the projectile? Like you're saying fragment. What does that mean compared to the projectile?
Well, as we've already
I'll
discussed,
be back, guys.
we have an entrance and an exit here. So essentially, the projectile exited the body. Before it did, a small piece of it broke off and remained in the tissues. This is that piece, and that's what I recovered at the autopsy.
Thank you, sir. And other than having been repackaged for trial purposes, does it appear to be in the same or substantially the same condition as when you removed it from Mr. Benefield's body?
It does.
Thank you. Your Honor, the state would ask to enter states 15.
No objection. Received.
Thank you. And Dr. Vega, I have a photo of states. This is states 97. Is that the same item that is in states 15?
Yes.
Thank you. Did you find any, I'm going to go back to the, well, Dr. Vega, what is stippling?
Stippling is a term we use to describe certain changes that occur in association with gunshot injuries. It refers to the pattern on the skin or any other target of unburned gunpowder fragments that strike that target and create a pattern.
And did you find any stippling associated with the gunshot wound to Mr. Benefield's leg?
I did not.
Did you find any with a wound associated with his chest?
I did not.
And what, if anything, does the absence of stippling tell you? Specifically, we'll talk about the leg first.
The absence it reflects the same principle in either injury. And what it means is that typically when the weapon was discharged, it was far enough away so that the unburned gunpowder fragments, which are ejected with the bullet, had a chance to lose velocity and fall away prior to striking the skin. In general, typically that means that the muzzle of the weapon was more than 3 feet away from the target or the skin in this case. But any more precise determinations require the test firing of a weapon, same weapon or same style of weapon with the same ammunition to try and get more specific information.
So they're trying to say like, oh, she wasn't that close. She was probably far away. But I mean, he's saying only 3 feet. That's still not very far away. Like if you're pressed against the wall, again, I'm just, speculating and trying to make this play out in my head. If you're backed up against a wall, he's at the, coming in through the door. I mean, I'm looking at my own room right now, and that's more than 3 feet, but it's still close. It's still close enough. And if somebody's coming at you at a fast rate, or even just coming at you, and you see them in the doorway and they're coming in, and you can see black in their eyes, which Ashley later goes on to testify when she talks about this moment. I mean, 3 feet really isn't that far. Not that far. But again, they're trying to prove like there was no struggle. They weren't, it wasn't super close up and personal. So that's going to be big.
And for the chest wound, if he were wearing a shirt when he was shot, would that affect what you would find on his body?
Yes.
Okay, that was why I was asking separately. And so to be clear, you said the muzzle. So would that mean that if
Yes.
okay, for the chest wound, if he were wearing a shirt when he was shot, would that affect what you would find on his body?
Yes.
Okay, that was why I was asking separately. And so
because I think they said, was he not wearing a shirt? I think I forget. Do you guys remember? But this is I think in this respect, this is good for the state in terms of like length and how far away. But again, 3 feet still isn't that far. So even if Ashley was backed up against the wall, I mean, he could still be posing a threat to her, from 5 or 6, potentially 6 feet, or even at minimum 3 feet. So close
to
enough.
be clear, you said the muzzle. So would that mean that if it's not necessarily the body of the shooter, but if they had their arm extended or even here, it's the end of the gun from Mr. Benefield's body?
That's right.
And I know you determined a path of travel and we're still talking about the leg injury, for this leg injury, but does it tell you this path of travel anything about where the shooter would have been standing?
All it really tells me is the relative position of the weapon to the leg at the time that the weapon was fired.
Yes, sir.
And trying to come up with the relative position of the shooter at the time that the weapon was discharged is much more complicated because both the shooter and the victim, and specifically the victim's leg, can be in multiple different positions and still end up with that required relative position of the gun to the leg and still create this same injury.
And Your Honor, may I have just one moment?
So there's doubt. I mean, to me, that's still doubt. That's not proving that Ashley was standing. That's not proving that she was carrying away. And that is the burden that the state carries is if you're coming to play ball, you got to bring the receipts. And for me, this just creates more doubt. This doesn't prove Ashley was standing and Ashley meant to do this. That I don't know. What say you? What do you guys think? Do you think this creates more doubt, or do you think this helps prove the state's case even more? Because for me, it just leaves me with more questions. And if you can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, then the verdict has to be not guilty.
Dr. Vega, if hypothetically Mr. Benefield were falling, would it make sense that his legs would flip up in the air enough for this path of travel? Does that make sense?
If this injury were sustained while he was falling,
Yes.
then the injury would be sustained while his body is changing its position and in motion. But regardless, at the time the weapon was fired, the muzzle of the weapon would still have to be, relatively speaking, below, to the left of, and behind the right leg in order to get this particular angle of path of travel through the leg.
Thank you. And can you tell when you conduct an autopsy, and specifically in Mr. Benefield, which of these wounds occurred in what order?
I cannot.
And
That was the big question I had, is which injury, because that could be huge for the state. It could be huge for the defense. But I think more so, I mean, again, if you're going in with trying to prove, yeah, Ashley wanted Doug to be unalived. She wanted Doug out of the picture. Then, again, with all her firearm training that you're trying to lead us up to believe, which was debunked by her mother. I mean, if you're going to take her mother's word for it, she wasn't going to the range with John Sands, the neighbor, in the days or weeks leading up to this. And a lot of people have GUNs in Florida. A lot of people know how to use a firearm, including Doug, who was in the Navy. So I think that would have been interesting if we could tell. I don't know what kind of expert could testify to that, if that's even possible, because I think that would say a lot for either the defense or the state. Because if Ashley did intend this and wanted this to happen, things to end this way, then what you could argue is she shot him, here first in the chest. Was that, which I'm assuming that was the fatal one. And then shot him in the other two places to cover it up, to make it look like self-defense. That would have been an interesting angle. But we don't know. We don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. So
once you completed your autopsy, did you order toxicology testing?
Yes,
And was that done in this case?
it was.
And were there any drugs or alcohol found in Mr. Benefield's body?
No, there were not.
And finally, based on everything that you did during your autopsy, did you determine the cause of death?
I did.
And what was that?
I determined the cause of death to be a gunshot wound to the chest that caused perforation of the lung, or the lungs, both lungs, with hemothoraces. It's a fancy word for bleeding that occurs in the chest.
And I didn't ask you this, but I guess, could you explain? So once this bullet entered Mr. Benefield and started to travel through his lungs, what would have been happening inside his body, or what would happen right after?
The primary things that happen there are that very rapid bleeding starts to occur. The bleeding is rapid because the lungs are very vascular. And so when they're damaged, they bleed very quickly. And also there's no impediment to the bleeding. The cavity around the lung can expand very rapidly to accommodate bleeding. So the bleeding that happens as a result of a gunshot wound to the lung is very rapid. In addition to the bleeding, when the lung gets a hole in it, it no longer holds its shape and its anatomical arrangements, and it collapses to some extent. That collapse is made worse by the accumulating blood pressing on the lung as well. So the combination of physiological effects of bleeding and lung collapse are the primary things that are occurring in the body at the time that, or immediately following the bullet passing through the lung.
Thank you. And did you determine the manner of death in this case?
I did.
And what was that?
I determined the manner of death to be homicide.
You're going to have just one moment.
And of course, the question is, do you need this?
I do not.
Yes, sir.
Very nice. Thank you.
Just a few questions, if I may.
Okay,
I think you
so
told
the state no longer has questions, and we're going to go to cross. A lot came out in that testimony. A lot came out. Again, does it help the state prove their case more? In my opinion, no. It just raises more questions. No, we don't know which came first, which bullet went through first. We don't know where Ashley was standing. And where he was shot did not match at all of anything of what the prosecutor claimed in opening statements. That does not match up. That's like a Lally moment of saying, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him 4 times instead of when it was allegedly 3 times. Or what about his timeline, right? This had to have happened at 12:45 a.m., even though Karen Reed was connected to John O'Keefe's Wi-Fi network at 12:36. And then the timeline changes to match their thing. So I'm getting a lot of Karen Reed vibes in this faux show.
us that the deceased was 169 pounds and stood 5 feet 9 inches tall,
Correct. Yes.
muscular build.
I don't think I use that terminology. I think I just talked about the weight and the body length.
I want to ask you mentioned about hollow points. You know, the public perception about hollow points is that they are more lethal. The fact is it not true that the hollow point is designed to expand when it goes through tissue?
Yes, that's right.
The theory being it's to stop a bullet from exiting and harming someone else.
That's certainly part of the philosophy or utility of having a hollow point projectile.
And when you tell us that the wound was probably not fatal, within a reasonable degree of medical science, and I think you made it pretty clear, you really can't say one way or another that upon being shot like that, he would have dropped immediately, that he may have continued for a couple of seconds.
Yes, that's right.
The stippling issue about gunpowder, it's from a distance of approximately, told us, 3 feet.
Roughly, yes.
Okay, that's, so when you exceed more than 3 feet, you would not expect to find stippling.
That's correct.
Okay, and you didn't find any stippling on his shirt.
I didn't examine his shirt.
Okay, so
Why?
if somebody were backing
There he
away
is.
while they were firing and they got beyond that 3-foot range, there may not be any stippling.
That's correct.
All right. You said that the wound to the scalp was indicative of, you traditionally see it, of somebody falling backwards and hitting a hard surface like a tile floor.
Yes.
I want to ask you just a couple other questions. Are all homicides crimes?
Objection, Judge. Beyond his expertise.
So this has to kind of do with the lead investigator of the case who had made a statement. I think I don't know if it was during like a deposition or, but at some point he made a statement and he hasn't testified because the state never called the lead prosecutor, which is interesting. It doesn't really look good for your case. I mean, even the freaking Commonwealth knew that they had to call Proctor. Because if you didn't, I mean, how bad does that look? But the state did not call the lead investigator in this case, Detective Warren, I think his name is. Remember the guy who Dr. Gilliam called, the DV detective that was assigned to Ashley's case, who's trying to get Florida to recognize her RO from South Carolina against Doug. And he played it off like, oh, I didn't know who the lead detective was. The lead investigator was for this case. But he contacted him. So that's what he's trying to get. He's like, do you think all homicides are crimes? And then I would assume that his next follow-up question would be, do you believe all homicides are murder? Because that is what Detective Warren has stated.
As determined by a medical examiner, has a certain medical legal significance, which does not necessarily imply criminality.
Okay. In simple language, it could be excusable,
Objection closed for legal.
I'll sustain.
justifiable. I think if it's within his knowledge, Your Honor.
No, I'm going to sustain because I asked for a legal conclusion as opposed to a medical conclusion.
All right. You mentioned, Dr. Vega, that you could not determine the order of the shots.
That's correct.
Okay, there is no medical method of being able to say which shot came first, which shot came second.
In certain cases, the physiological findings may help you with that, but in this case, no.
Would it be a fair statement for me to say that for the chest shot, the weapon would have had to have been pointing at his chest from the front?
Yes.
Not from the back or the sides.
Let me just check, Your Honor. I think that might
Yes, sir.
conclude.
I mean, that's all you really need. Great question. That's all you really need, Taylor. I liked his questions too.
Um,
I liked his question too about the order of the GUN shot wounds. Because if you can't determine the order, then again that just creates more further reasonable doubt. So I really liked his line of questioning here. The thing about the crimes and the homicide, I think he probably could have skipped over that because probably not the right witness, but these two questions incredibly important. And even like Doug being able to, after that, if that was the first shot to the chest that ultimately ended up leading to the cause of his death or his manner of death, would it be possible for him to still be in motion after getting shot? He testified, yeah, it's possible. So again, it's just more doubt for me about what actually happened in that room on that day.
You've told us that the gun would have had to have been lower than the leg to get that upward trajectory.
Yes, although I would say that, lower is a relative term.
Yeah.
And legs can be put into various different positions. And if we're going to say lower, then it needs to be clear that lower means with respect to the leg in an upright position. And if the leg were horizontal, for example, then we might be talking about a position which is above the leg, but pointing up towards the head of the body, for example.
Okay, so let's try to be clear here. If Mr. Benefield fell backwards and his legs went up in the air, might that injury be consistent with that?
Given that scenario, it's possible.
I believe that's all I have, Your Honor.
Great
Thank you, Doc.
questions.
State any redirect?
Great questions. And I wonder too how tall Ashley is. I feel like I know she's tall. Does anybody know how tall Ashley is? Is she also the same height as Doug? Do we know? Does anybody know how tall she is? I'd be curious because I feel like that also comes into play too. If she is naturally shorter than him, or if she's the same height.
I don't want it to be unclear. The gun would have, for the chest wound, the gun would have had to have been in front of Mr. Benefield's body. That's what you said.
Yes.
But it didn't enter his chest. It entered the front of him. It entered through the side.
Yes. So the weapon did have to be in front of him, but even more so, it had to be to his right side.
So he's saying, yeah, it could have entered from the side, but it was still shot from the front. He's playing
Based on-
that back.
So the weapon,
For the chest wound, the gun would have had to have been in front of Mr. Benefield's body. That's what you said.
yes.
But it didn't enter his chest. It entered the front of him. It entered through the side.
Yes. So the weapon did have to be in front of him, but even more so, it had to be to his right side.
And based on your training and experience, is it typical that if somebody were to fall backwards, that their legs would go above their heads when falling?
Without the intervention of something to fall over, an ottoman, a chair, or something like that, it seems unlikely.
And if Mr. Benefield were running or his legs were up in the back, could the angle have also been accomplished?
Yes.
Now you're trying to say that he was running
Thank you,
away.
Doctor. I don't have anything else.
That's all.
All right, can the witness be released?
Again, this just creates way more doubt. So they're saying, okay, his legs may have been up in the air, maybe it wasn't up in the air. There's no real way to tell. He's saying, the medical examiner saying that unless he, fell, there was an ottoman in the way or something. And I mean, we don't know. We don't know where he exactly was standing, do we? And if that's possible. But for me, I mean, that doesn't even matter. For me, the biggest thing is where the fatal shot was shot from. The biggest thing for me is the fact that he acknowledged that the weapon, in fact, had to be in front of Doug, not in the back. So now what the state is trying to say is, well, I mean, could he have been running? And that's the reason why his legs would have been up in the air and he would have sustained that shot to the calf. Okay. But are there any signs of him running? It's just more questions. Like I feel like the state is trying to poke holes in their own case. And it's just helping the defense more and more. Like that's the way it's coming off to me. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. So I just want to get into a little bit of this. This is the last witness before the state rests. This is the firearm expert who analyzed the firearm that was discharged and ultimately caused the fatal injuries to Douglas Benefield at the hands of Ashley Benefield. They're going to talk about the t-shirt. So this is where I got a little confused with their line of questioning before. So like he was wearing a shirt, he wasn't wearing a shirt. It seems like he was wearing a shirt. And they're trying to, I guess, gauge again what the distance was between Ashley and Doug. Was there enough room for her to have discharged the firearm? So again, proving that this was something that she wanted to happen, something that she fully intended on doing, or is it possible that this could have been within that 3 feet or so range that Dr. Russell Vega had just testified to, and in terms of gauging the distance between the two of them?
Can you kind of describe what that entails?
So what that entails is what we're trying to accomplish is if there was a max distance to the discharge of the firearm to a garment that we receive. In this case, I received one t-shirt, and what I will do is I will visually, microscopically, and chemically test the t-shirt to see if there's any presence of gunshot residue or any vaporous lead from the firing process. So what happens when a gun goes off is there's a cloud of smoke that comes out of the gun. That's the vaporous lead that's caused from the primer material. What that is it will create basically a sooting around the hole, and it's indicative of a closed shot. There's also gunpowder particles that can get left behind on the t-shirt as well. And some of those you can't see visually or microscopically, so we have to do chemical comparisons. In this case, I didn't see anything visually or microscopically, and I also did chemical testing to test for those burned gunpowder particles as well as that vaporous lead, and I was able to determine anything.
You got ahead of me.
I'm sorry.
But it's okay. This is states too. Is this an item
Yes.
you previously analyzed in your lab?
Yes, ma'am.
So that's the t-shirt.
And I just want to slow you down a little bit and back up. So when you analyze this, you're looking for microscopic particles of
Gunpowder.
gunpowder. Thank you. And when you examined the shirt, did you find any of that?
No, ma'am.
And did you make any other observations? Any observations that indicated to you that this shirt was involved in a shooting at all?
Just besides the hole, no, ma'am.
Thank you. And what might explain the lack of gunshot powder on this shirt?
There's a multitude of reasons. Some of the common ones are going to be, it could be poor evidence handling. It could have maybe shaken off some of the gunpowder particles. It could be an intervening object. If there's something in between at the time of discharge, obviously those gunpowder particles or residues cannot make it to the actual t-shirt. It could be that there was either blood or debris that could have inhibited the chemical processing or masked any of the gunpowder residue that was on there. And then finally, it could be too far away to actually produce onto the shirt itself.
And what distance might you expect to find stippling on a shirt if those other factors were not involved?
It's various, but with a pistol of this nature, the gunpowder particles will typically fall off around 5 to 6 feet, and the vaporous lead will fall off around about 2 to 3 feet.
Thank you, sir. Judge, may I have just a moment? I don't have anything else for this witness, the defense may. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Now we're getting across.
Very briefly, Mr. Alexasrewm, your testimony here today is basically that the ammunition was fired from that gun in this case.
Yes, sir.
And you found no evidence of stippling or gunpowder residue.
That's correct.
And there's all kinds of reasons why that might be.
Yes, sir.
Thanks very much.
You're very welcome.
Redirect.
No, sir. Thank you.
Can this witness be released?
Yes.
Mr. Taylor?
Yes, sir.
Sir, you're released from your subpoena. You're free to go.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
And with that, the state rests. So no stippling, could have been caused by a number of things. So again, it's just more questions. I don't know if you guys have more questions, but I definitely do. What did you think about the medical examiner's testimony? Do you think that supported the state's theory about what they believe to have happened that day where Ashley Benefield shot Douglas Benefield? I feel like it just raises more questions to me. It doesn't prove self-defense necessarily, but it doesn't prove intent. It doesn't prove that this was something she wanted to happen and that she was trying to unalive him purposely. I don't get that at all. I think it's very plausible that she was in fear for her life in that moment. But that the weapon itself would have had to have been facing Douglas, but he would have had to have been facing the weapon. And that's huge for me. That's huge because it goes to show that no, his back was not turned. There's no evidence of him trying to flee. And this is the state's case. They have rested. This is what they've given us. And I feel like it's kind of weak. I feel like there's a lot of things that they could have done differently, including, I don't know, maybe even bringing this or not bringing this to trial with the lack of evidence that they have, not calling the lead investigator. It's your case. It's your frickin' case. And who's your slam dunk witness? Stephanie Murphy? Who practically perjured herself on the stand? The medical examiner who literally just raised way more questions? This case is beyond fascinating to me. And it's only getting crazier from here because next video that we pick up on, we're going to dive right into Ashley Benefield's testimony. She takes the stand. Then we'll go through some of the other additional testimony, and hopefully over the next 24 hours, we can catch up in real time. We'll be at verdict watch. We'll go through closing arguments. The defense's case lasted, I believe, just 2 days. So pretty similar to the timeline of the Karen Reed defense's case as well, except the state did have a very short rebuttal, whereas in the Karen Reed case, I don't think there was, from what I can recall, I don't believe there was any rebuttal on the Commonwealth's end. So we will be following this, continuing to follow this extremely closely. But let me know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think, again, the medical examiner's testimony just helped prove the state's case even more? Did it raise more questions for you like it did for me? I want to know what you think. And as always, please keep it respectful in the comment section below. If you disagree, that's fine. We can agree to disagree. But please, no like vitriol, no just hate towards DV survivors. I'm not going to tolerate that garbage on my channel. Maybe other communities will, but I'm not going to. If you think that in that moment, yeah, sure, she wasn't, you don't believe her personal safety was in danger, that's fine. I think there's a way for us to have a respectful discussion. If you believe that she was doing this out of self-defense, like I do, I mean, I'm not gonna hide that from you guys. That's what I honestly think based on the evidence that's been presented. I have so many more questions, way too many questions, than the timeline of than what room for this video will allow. So with that being said, if you like today's video, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss another video from me. Make sure you hit that like button, which is extremely important because it tells the YouTube algorithm that this is newsworthy news. And I think this story is just probably some of the same stories that you guys have had too in this community. I know that there are so many factors playing into it, so many parts of it that remind me of my own personal experiences, which is why I'm so passionate about covering this case. So I will see you in the next video when we go through Ashley Benefield's testimony. All right, take care, guys, and stay safe.